clear they're going to fight this impeachment inquiry tooth and nail, including the production of any documents or witnesses. They're trying to make a legal argument now. They don't need to comply until House Speaker Nancy Pelosi holds a full House vote first. That's not anywhere in the Constitution. They're just making that up. Although it is the case, to be fair, the last two impeachment inquiries began in part with a full House vote. All of this just highlights the fact that each presidential impeachment is its own thing with no charted path. There's basically nothing in the Constitution about how to actually go about doing it. We've only done it 3 times in our nation's history. We're out past the frontier. So I thought it'd be good to talk to 3 people who are part of the investigation and impeachment inquiry of Richard Nixon. A former assistant Watergate special prosecutor, now an MSNBC legal analyst, Jill Wine-Banks. Also former assistant Watergate special prosecutor, former assistant secretary of the Treasury, Richard Davis. And a former member of the House Judiciary Committee that passed 3 articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon, former Democratic Congresswoman from New York, Elizabeth Holtzman. Great to have you guys here. Maybe I'll start with you as a member of Congress. So we got word tonight that they have subpoenaed the White House. Mick Mulvaney, Vice President Pence, documents. This is a big deal constitutionally. What does it mean? Where does it go? And who resolves it?
Well, we went through that in the Nixon impeachment process. And by the way, we started the impeachment process before there was a House vote during the Nixon impeachment. We started actually reading the Constitution and trying to figure out what a high crime and misdemeanor was way before we had a House authorization.
Oh, so you were out. The
Absolutely.
Vote came later. Yeah,
we started. We had staff. That's just nonsense what the administration is saying. It's not historical. Secondly, the administration totally stonewalled us. It didn't totally stonewall. Nixon got up and said, oh, look at all the documents I'm turning over. He had these 3-ring binders. He said, I've given everything. But, of course, they were doctored transcripts. And when we compared the transcripts against the actual tapes, there were not just expletives deleted, but there were other important things deleted, things added. They were totally doctored. And that was my view about the transcript we saw. I mean, you can't trust it.
Right. Well, the transcript we saw, recalls, right, like infamously the Nixon tapes have this missing section. The transcript we saw seems to have these ellipses. It doesn't seem to time out. What would be the process for going about, Rich, what would be the process for going about to get the full thing?
Well, obviously, that's what they're going to subpoena because, normally you would say, well, there's a great executive privilege argument. This is, after all, a presidential conversation. But they've already released the summary or the summary transcript. So I think that is not going to be a strong argument here. But in the end of the day, what we've seen from this White House is their position is they don't really care. They'll just say no. And as Liz said, ultimately, in Watergate, Article 3, the 3rd article, was failure to respond to subpoenas, a series of subpoenas. And that's what happened then. And we'll see whether that's what happens now or this gets resolved by the courts.
But there's the courts. What's really fascinating to me is that this is this kind of fascinating legal education because we're in such a weird space constitutionally. Like there's this nebulousness about who's going to adjudicate this and which branch has primacy. And one of the things that's fascinating to me, Jill, is that they are clearly in a stronger position having just announced an impeachment inquiry. Like already that has made people show up and documents have been turned over. There is something about the invocation of that, it seems to me, that has its own kind of force.
Well, it's not just an imagination that you have, because the courts have made it clear that when there's a judicial proceeding pending, you have more powers. And an impeachment is a judicial proceeding. The subpoena in our case, of course, was for a grand jury. And ultimately, the one that went to the Supreme Court was for trial. It wasn't, the grand jury had already indicted.
Right.
And we then subpoenaed more tapes. And you're right, the ellipses that are in the sort of
call
summary,
notes,
the call notes, are now being called the Rosemary moment of this scandal, or the 18-minute gap. And so I'm volunteering to help.
You would be willing to go in there. So,
the subpoena, if it comes out, the issue whether it's a judicial proceeding might be an issue because somebody would say, well, it's an impeachment, it's not judicial. However, what's been stripped away by having an impeachment inquiry is any argument there's no legislative purpose, which is
Right.
one of the things they've been saying.
And they've been using that in courts to stonewall them on.
That's what one of their major arguments has been, no legislative purpose. Well, the purpose here is to investigate whether there's been abuse of power. And plainly, they don't have any of that kind of defense.
That's an important point, yeah.
Yeah, the other thing is Chairman Rodino, during the Nixon impeachment, said we're not going to the courts because the impeachment power is solely in the hands of Congress, and the courts can't determine what Congress decides is important. So there are two things I wanted to say about that. Number one is that if Congress decides, that means the American people, in the end, because they support this process,
Right.
then there will be an impeachment article on this ground. And the second thing is that I think Adam Schiff is being really smart, and the other committee chairs are being really smart about how they're handling these subpoenas. Because what they're saying to the administration is, if you don't turn over those subpoenas, we're going to draw an adverse inference, and we're going to decide that basically
Right.
you've got something to cover up and hide.
Right, because
They're
there's no
being
external.
really tough.
There's no. I mean, that's a really important point. This is constitutionally granted to Congress as their Article I power, right? So their whole point is there's not some out there judicial proceeding. There's no like pleading the fifth. Like, we're the ones sitting in judgment.
Correct.
Right.
And
So
that's
if
how
you
it should-
obstruct us, we're going to come to the worst possible conclusion about the documents you haven't turned
Correct.
over, and that's our right as Congress.
You know, legally, that's of course permissible in any court. But let's face it, people would normally just draw that conclusion.
Right.
Even with the Fifth Amendment, you know, you're
Right.
instructed you shouldn't draw an adverse inference, but people do because they know you're hiding something if you won't come forward with it.
I'd like to go back to this issue of whether you need a House resolution.
Yeah.
One of the reasons they had House resolutions in '74 and in the Clinton impeachment was because of the nature of the House rules as they then existed. Since that time, the House rules and the committee rules have been changed. They have a much greater power to issue subpoenas just by the chair, and they have much greater power to have staff depositions than they had. So in those cases, one of the purposes of the resolution was to increase
That's a great
the
point.
power beyond what the House had delegated through rules. It's not linked to the ability to get information.
In fact, in the subpoena document letter that was issued today by the oversight committees, which I read, they basically make that argument. They say this is pursuant to our impeachment abilities, but we don't actually even need that because of the House rules that the Congress passed, the House passed in the beginning. Here's my question about this moment for you, sort of in a historical perspective. I think there's this sense that everyone has, that, like, we know what's going to happen. The House will impeach him, and the Senate will acquit, and he'll rail about whatever. I feel like things are much more dynamic than that. I feel that we genuinely don't know what's going to happen. And I'm curious, having lived through Watergate, if you have that feeling too.
Absolutely. When we started the impeachment process after the Saturday Night Massacre and President Nixon ordered the firing of the special prosecutor, the American people said, hey, wait a minute, we're not a banana republic. Wait a minute, Congress, you do something. When we started it, we didn't know what an impeachment was. We didn't even know what a high crime and misdemeanor was. We didn't have a vote count in the House of Representatives.
Right.
We didn't have a vote count on the committee. Forget the Senate. We didn't even know what the case was. When we started from scratch. But we built a case, and we did it in a fair way. We built it based on solid evidence, and the American people were with us. And so anyone who would have predicted at that time never be an impeachment, they were wrong. You can't predict this. If the Congress acts in a responsible, fair, and honorable way, the American people will be with it.
Well, we're going to see what happens. Jill Wine-Banks, Richard Davis, and Elizabeth Holtman, thank you all for being here.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.